version to make an account. You don't have to be. However, you do need to log into the web version once every 6 months to sort of re-up your account. And that's just telling EndNote that, hey, you're logging in from inside one of our networks. You should give access to our subscription. And that's just for the web version. The desktop version, you don't need any sort of web VPN or network credentials or anything like that. It's just a straight download. Cool. Anything else?
That's all I'm seeing in the chat so far. Any other questions about access?
Awesome.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a very quick installation. It literally takes like minutes. And sometimes it's even faster than that. So it's relatively straightforward to do that. Okay, so now that you've downloaded it, what we're sort of gonna look at is sort of the 3 steps that you take to get references from a database into your EndNote library and into a Word document. And so the first thing we're gonna kind of take a look at is just how to get references out of databases. And this is going to be the same no matter which of these programs you use, what your typical workflow is. This will always be the best way to go about this and the most efficient, fastest, easiest way. So we're going to use PubMed as an example. I would always recommend pulling references out of PubMed. They are more than likely always going to be the most descriptive. They're going to have all of the most relevant information on them. It's much better than pulling references out of something like Google Scholar, and ironically, even pulling references from the journal itself sometimes is missing information. So if you are doing a search and you're pulling references out and it's in PubMed, highly recommend using PubMed to collect references, even if you're not doing your search in PubMed. It's just a much more organized sort of database. So I have this very broad search that I've done. And so now, as I'm going through this, I'm kind of like, hey, I would like to include a few of these references in my bibliography and hopefully use them to write a paper later on down the road. So pretty much all you need to do is select the references that you like. And like everything else in PubMed, if you don't select anything, it selects everything by default. So we'll say we don't want all 1,400 of these. We just want the first 4. So you just select the ones you want, click Send To. And then they have a link here for Citation Manager. What this does is it generates a file that is called an mbib file. It's machine readable. If you were to open it up and look in like a Word text editor or the Word document or something like that, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell what it is. But in order to get it to your library, typically all you need to do is just click on it and open it up. And EndNote knows to read an mbib file. That's by default when you download it. Those connections are made sort of in the background. If that doesn't work for you, you can always import references later, and we'll show you how to do that as well. So what we've done is we've just added those 4 references into an EndNote library. Relatively straightforward. It does all of the sort of mapping into the different fields for you, so it knows what the author list is, what the year is, the title, journal, etc. If you're ever curious about all of the information that it is collecting, you can view it on one of the reading panes on the right. And if you ever need to edit any of the information, you can do that here as well. So this is very important because depending on what your sort of field is, sometimes you might be looking at papers that are kind of on the bleeding edge and that may not have a volume or issue yet. If you're in PubMed, sometimes you'll see papers that are preprints and they don't have any of this information that you'll need to cite it later on. So you can come through kind of later on once it's been published, and if you need to, you can manually add this information here. Thankfully, you don't have to do that manually. PubMed will also look up reference updates if necessary. So you can do that by selecting references that you've brought in and say, find reference updates. And what this does is it just goes through, and EndNote uses their own database just to check to make sure that all the relevant information is there. And these all look pretty good. So if there's like a discrepancy here, it'll ask you which one you want, and you can go back and forth like that. So I typically will do that on a regular basis if I'm working on a paper with someone. I'll just pop in every now and then and do find reference updates for all of my references. And again, that's only if you really need to to update your reference. So this one, for instance, doesn't have an issue yet. When we get further down the line, it's been e-published like a week ago, so the issue will get referenced eventually. So we'll just have to update that on occasion. Not the greatest thing, it doesn't do it automatically, but it's a nice way to do that. You'll also notice that we just have the reference. It didn't bring the PDF along with us. And that is a relatively simple thing to do. We can just, again, highlight everything, say find full text. And if you're on the network, it won't ask you to log in to EasyProxy. If you're off the network, that login with your CVD and password window will pop up. And it'll essentially go through and try to find the PDF if we subscribe to it. And if we do subscribe to it, it will attach it to the record. And now you have it available in your EndNote library, as well as downloaded onto your computer without having to go through the library's catalog, which is a mess. And we know it's a mess. This is usually a much quicker way to do it. The only issue you might run into here is EndNote is owned by one of the big publishers. And so some of the other publishers don't want to make their database open to a rival publisher to search and attach full text. So things that we might subscribe to, like Elsevier journals and things like that, don't often come in via this like one-click attached PDF to the record. So that's something just to keep in mind. So just because it doesn't attach automatically doesn't mean we don't have a subscription to it. It just means that it didn't come in via this automated collection. So it'll take a lot of the busy work out of it for you, but it won't find everything. You can have that set to do it automatically. So if that is something you're interested in, if you go to preferences, there's a section called PDF handling, and you can click enable automatic importing. I don't do that because sometimes when I work a lot of systematic reviews with folks, and sometimes I'm importing hundreds or thousands of papers into EndNote, and to have it sit there and think about trying to find the PDF as they're coming in takes forever. So if you're doing a few articles at a time, this is the you can turn that on. But if you're doing more than like 10 or 15 or 20, I would just turn it off and then do it once everything's in, because you can set it to run and then you can go get something to drink or do whatever and come back, and everything that can be attached will be attached. The other thing we'll sort of mention real quick is there's a sort of a bibliographic preview window that's available. And right now it's displaying what a reference in the bibliography would look like based on this style. So this is a style based on NLM. It's been amended to show all authors, if that's something that you ever need to do. And this is what it would look like. And here you can just sort of switch styles on the fly and see what it would look like in a various other styles. And this is helpful because some journals will tell you we want it in a particular style, but we want these things to be amended. So you can actually sort of look at it and make sure that it's what you want. This is an abbreviated style list. If you click select another style, you get a huge list. And this isn't even everything. If you ever are publishing in a journal that is not included in this list, typically if you Google the name of that journal and EndNote style, someone has created it and uploaded it to an EndNote style database that EndNote itself maintains. So if you Google, journal EndNote style, you can typically download it and then add it to your style library so that you can do that. And the reason this is necessary is because every journal sort of does different styles. Unfortunately, we haven't all agreed on one. So sometimes there's like little niche things here and there that we have to take a look at. We're not going to get into actually editing individual styles, but that is something you can do if you do ever feel the need to play around. So if you go to output style and then edit or open style manager, that allows you to tweak things as you see fit. So it's impossible to overwrite style. So if you're going to like, oh, use Vancouver, but again, you will maybe want to include all authors instead of just the first like 5. That's something you can do, and you won't worry about overwriting Vancouver. It forces you to rename it. So that's something that's very handy. Any questions, just very general, about populating your library and just sort of the basic kind of views here? Awesome. So we'll keep it rolling. What a lot of people tend to really gravitate towards when they see this is that you can actually search PubMed inside of EndNote. This is a very wonky search, so beware if you want to just skip the whole exporting step into your desktop version and you just want to search PubMed directly. This is only really useful if you're looking for a very specific reference. Say you know the title and you know one of the authors and the year. You can search that here and then just add it to your library without going into PubMed. But like I said, it's not great for doing like broad searches because it's a bit of a like a mess. But it is useful if you're just looking for one paper, just to sort of get that out there. What else you'll notice is that there is this ability to create groups. So in this instance, if we wanted to create a new group here, let's call it Tech Tuesday test group. And we wanted to add these 2 references. It's just drag and drop. So fairly straightforward. You'll see it's just a copy. There's still 4 references in my all reference list. This is just copy it to this group right here. And if I delete them out of this group, come on, there we go. Remove references from group. It actually tells you that it's just removing it from the group and you're not deleting it from your library. So you're never really are at risk of losing anything. And even if you do delete something, it gets moved to your trash, and your trash is never automatically deleted. There's really no reason to ever automatically delete or to manually delete or empty your trash. So it kind of keeps track of everything, which is great. So what we can do is we can continue to add groups. How many people use groups is to separate their projects that they're working on. So there's sort of a divide in the EndNote community about if you're working on multiple projects, you have multiple libraries. So say this is the library for Tech Tuesday. If I'm working on a project with some colleagues, do I have a completely different library with them? Or do I have a completely different library for groups X, Y, and Z? Or do I have one library with multiple groups? So I can have like a group for, paper 1, and then we can make another group for paper 2 or 3, and so on and so forth. This is how EndNote currently is built to operate. It's meant to be one library file, which is this sort of window here, and then multiple groups based on your specific projects. That is not the way it was 4, 5, 6 versions ago, where people had multiple libraries. So if you're working with someone who's a longtime EndNote user, they may want to do the multiple library thing, which means you sort of have to do the multiple library thing, or you can do the group thing if you're working on like a new project or something like that. There is always some confusion about that because it's kind of down to personal preference and how you've used EndNote in the past, if at all. But is there any questions about that?
We've got a couple questions coming in. Yeah, maybe the one that makes most sense to start with since you're here is, can you show once more how to create a new group?
Sure. So yeah, there's a couple different ways. You can right click on My Groups and create group. or you can go to groups and then create group from here. There's a lot of other options here. We're not going to worry about that at the moment. But yeah, so create group, and one of these locations will enable that to you.
Okay, and then okay, great. That answered her question. And a couple more. How does this compare with using Mendeley? Is this better?
So it's very different. So Mendeley is free. So we don't have an institutional kind of relationship with Mendeley. One of the things that Mendeley does better at is collaborative writing, and when we get to the word portion, we'll sort of talk about the differences there. The main issue with Mendeley is that it again is owned by one of the publishers. It's sort of part of the Elsevier kind of ecoverse. So it doesn't always play well with other references either. But as far as their basic functionality, they're generally the same. EndNote has more deeper customization. So the customizing citation styles and things like that, that is better in EndNote. But if you never need to do that, Mendeley is perfectly fine. It's just two different tools that do sort of the same thing. Mendeley is more lightweight and it's easier to sort of move around in. EndNote's a little clunkier, but it has like deeper depth, if that makes sense. But again,
Great.
it's
And
more,
one more.
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. One more question. Will we discuss sharing library without corrupting the file?
So yeah, sharing was going to be the next
Oh,
topic,
then okay.
because that's another thing that gets very complicated.
Okay.
And somebody mentioned file corruption. I'm sure that's happened to them before. When
Yes,
it's sort of it's sort of a relatively common thing, unfortunately. So we'll move on to the sharing aspect.
Great. Oh, one more question. Can you use this on a mobile phone or iPad?
Yes, there is an app. So the app is available from the normal app stores, Google Play or the Apple App Store, and that requires a web login, which again we'll jump over to in a little bit. But yeah, that's how you sync everything up.
Excellent. Okay.
Okay, so now we have our references in the library. Now we sort of get to the concept of sharing. Yeah, EndNote is behind the curve, I think, on this compared to something like Mendeley or SciWheel, which is another tool that focuses more on collaboration than EndNote does. So there are instances you work in a group, nobody writes papers alone anymore. There's tons of people on it. And you want to share groups of references. There's a couple different ways to do it, and they all involve going through the web version. So I think we'll probably pivot to talking about the web version a little bit right now. So from the desktop, though, you can sort of initiate that. And there's two different ways to do it. The best, quote unquote, best way is to share individual groups. So if you're working on a group project with someone, say I'm working on this with Bridget, I'm working on this with Michelle, and I'm working on this paper with Vanessa, I can do all of that and manage all of that sharing with different people inside of this groups menu. So that's just done with share group. And you see it's asking me to sync, and we'll get to that in a second. You can also, in newer versions of EndNote, share the whole library. That is a tricky proposition that we do not recommend people do because it almost never works out well. So you can share the library in the same fashion. The problem is if you're across multiple operating systems and versions of EndNote, you run into issues like the file being corrupted, or if you have the EndNote library on like a shared drive, if it's on like OneDrive or SharePoint or something like that, and you have multiple people working on it on the same time, that's almost an instantaneous error that's going to get thrown. So if you are working collaboratively with people, I highly recommend doing it via groups and not the whole library. It's just the cleanest, most efficient way to do that. It can work if you have the library on a shared drive, but everyone has to be on the same versions of all software, same version of EndNote, Word, and operating system. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. is kind of the first thing we troubleshoot when people have issues with their library. So one library shared via groups. Does that make sense? Cool. So I've done a lot of talk about sharing and the web version. So we'll jump over to the web version now, because that's sort of how sharing is managed in EndNote. So I have just an account that I've been using for a long time that goes back very long. Tons of groups that I have shared with like tons of different people. And the reason why you don't see that on this version of EndNote that I have set up is that this version of EndNote, this library, isn't synced to my web version, which again, if you missed the beginning, it's myendnoteweb.com. Now, if I wanted to sync these two together, I could do that with the desktop version. Go to, come on, mouse. There we go. Preferences, sync. And then I just put in the same credentials that I used to create my EndNote web account, which is a free account. And it doesn't have to be your Cornell email address. It could be whatever you want. So once you enter your credentials in here and click Enable Sync, every time you open or close the desktop, it's going to push a sync in both directions. So if I synced it to this library, it would copy everything that's been added in both directions and rebuild the file structure in both directions. So everything that's in here would get brought in here, and everything that's in here would also get brought in here. And once that's done, you can then share with individual people in each particular group. The only time that this can become problematic is if you are one of the people who have multiple libraries. So say you have 5 different libraries for 5 different projects, and you want to sync all of them with your web account. EndNote's going to get confused because this basically acts as a single library. So every time you sync a new library with this one, it's going to push changes back and forth, and you could potentially lose references or overwrite some things, and that's something that nobody ever really wants. So what you're always going to do is, if possible, via sharing, is again share via individual groups, because all the groups will make the transition over, and you won't have to worry about libraries getting confused with other libraries and things like that. That is probably the second most frequent problem people run into, is trying to sync multiple desktop libraries with their web library and then being confused that it doesn't always match up, or they have to redo it every time. And I'm not going to do it now because the first time you sync, it takes forever. But subsequent times, it's much quicker. Any questions about that? I know that's confusing, and I went through it very quickly.
There are a few questions, not specifically about that, but a couple. Could you mention possibly at the end how you import the PDF within the citation?
Sure. Yeah, so if you have references that you've brought in, and you can either do it manually, which is what I typically do. I just highlight everything and you right click and go find full text. And it's already done it, so it won't find anything new, but it will attach automatically to the record. Or again, you can do it through the preferences PDF handling and enable automatic importing.
Great. Cool. And then one more, the web version of EndNote has only a few styles available to choose from. Is there a way to import different styles to online EndNote account? Yeah,
the EndNote online version is very stripped down, much more stripped down than the desktop. So if you have access to both, highly recommend using the desktop, and only use the web if you're sharing, or if you're on another computer that doesn't have desktop, say you're visiting family or something and you're on the family computer, and you need to add references to your library, you can do that with the web account as well. As far as actually writing with the web account, if you don't have to, we would strongly discourage it, but I'll show you kind of what that looks like inside Word if you have to use the web account. But yeah, the citation style options are much more limited because you're using their preset list and you're not able to like download and add new styles to that list because the software doesn't like live on your machine, if that makes sense. Cool. So also if you find yourself liking importing using the web version and then syncing to your desktop, there are plugins that you can get to make that a little nicer. I don't like to use the web plugins because to me they're not that much quicker, but there is an EndNote web plugin that basically lets you move straight from PubMed to EndNote web, so you can check that out if you're interested in that. I believe information is available, on the downloads section or in like your Chrome store or whatever browser store that you use. But again, to me, it's not any more efficient than just doing download, install, import. Okay, so we'll jump into the Word portion of it, which is kind of like the third leg. And in some ways it's the easiest, but it can also be the times where, or the place where things get really messed up. So we'll start out basic. If you've downloaded the desktop version, it will automatically install the EndNote plugin for you. If you are using the web version, you can download it from the downloads ribbon and just download whatever version is ready for you. So if you're like me and you sometimes use both, you can actually toggle in between the two versions under the EndNote ribbon preferences. And if you go to application, you can tell it which one you're using. So if you're using the online version, it's going to look a little different. Don't want to log in. Yeah, so you have less options here than if you're using the desktop version. So what a lot of times what happens is people are working on, they've installed it on the web version, and for whatever reason, the application didn't update. So they're trying to insert references to a library that doesn't exist really. And it's just because they're not using the right application. So if you ever have any issues with the web plugin, the very first thing to do is to make sure that you have the right application selected. And again, that's preferences, application. So I'm on the desktop, so I'm going to use the desktop version. And then if I'm typing along and all I want to do is cite that lovely sentence there, if I go to insert citation, you can type in any keyword, any author, year, any word in the title, and really any word that's in any of the fields that EndNote indexes. Say we like that. We'll do insert, and it pops in an in-text citation, and it starts building a bibliography at the end. So if we ever wanted to change that, say one journal said, hey, we need this in Vancouver, and we write a paper using this style, and then they say, okay, we don't like this paper, we're rejecting it. You want to submit it to another journal that wants it in NLM. It reformats this and the bibliography as well. It's one touch, it's very nice. And again, it's the same list as in desktop. Select another style, it's a big list, or you can find the style on your own and import it. There are a lot of other sort of bells and whistles here. Let me just do another one so you can kind of see what it looks like. And then if we wanted to add a citation to this, we just click on it, insert citation. And it continues to build it out, and it does this automatically. If I delete something, it automatically removes it from the bibliography. This is great if you have a short document. If you're at like a dissertation level or even like a longer journal articles, sometimes you might have hundreds of references. And essentially what you do when you insert a reference is Word sits through and it recalculates all of this stuff. And that can take a while, and it can sometimes crash Word. So if you have a long bibliography, what I tend to recommend doing is to turn instant formatting from the default of on to off. And what that does, you'll notice, is it doesn't add a reference and it doesn't add a line to the bibliography. It just makes this like little placeholder here. Nothing recalculated. It didn't process or buffer anything. But it puts a placeholder here that tells EndNote in Word what to do. And if you ever have to do it, you can just go to Update Citations, and then updates that, and then it updates the bibliography if it needs to. Obviously, that's a very handy thing to do if you have a large document. So my general workflow and suggestion is, if you're doing something large, turn instant formatting off. Do all of your writing, adding references, stuff like that. And if you get to a stopping point, save the document and then hit Update Citations and Bibliography. That way, if something happens, if there's a crash while it's calculating everything, you still have a saved version before the crash happened and you're not stuck, which is unfortunately something that happens for every now and then. That is basically it for basically inserting references into Word documents. Any questions about that?
Yeah, a few questions in the chat.
Sure.
Is there a way to prevent importing of duplicate citations? I'm envisioning our lab team's EndNote file to be collaborative, but noticing this is a frequent issue we're facing.
Sure. If that's a problem, instead of just double clicking the reference file when it gets downloaded from PubMed, if you manually import it by going to File, Import, then you can determine what happens with duplicates here. So a lot of times what people will do is they'll import it into a duplicates library just so you have it, just in case it's not actually a duplicate. You know what I mean? So that's something to keep into mind. But yeah, that's via a manual file import.
Great. Looks like that answered that question for Joey.
Cool.
Another question, is there a way to import other citations for information from websites such as CDC, WHO, or books?
So if it's a website, what I would recommend doing is if you go to references and type new reference and just filling this information out manually. Unfortunately, there's not like a great way to do that. And this way you're in control of the information that's available. So for websites, basically like you change it to website, web page, and then you just include as much information as you possibly can. And EndNote will know how to reference that or formulate the reference based on whatever style you choose. So, for websites, page number and like year, date accessed and stuff like that are typically what they want to know. But the style will handle the tricky part of formatting that for you.
Great. Do you recommend adding citations as you go, or do them all at once at the end when you're done writing?
Sure. So that's going to be like, that was like my next thing with Word. If you're writing by yourself, one Word document on your computer, you're the only one writing, it's perfectly fine to just insert them as you go using the plugin. Perfectly fine. However, if you are, which I'm sure we all do at this point, if you're sharing the document back and forth via a shared drive, if it's on OneDrive or SharePoint or something, and you're downloading it, writing it, emailing it back and forth, all that fun stuff, what can happen is references can get out of sync. So if I write this paper and I email it to Bridget, and she just opens it and starts adding references, sometimes Word will not know that it is supposed to be in the same EndNote library as the one that I was using, even if we're sharing groups and things like that. What it'll do sometimes is it'll restart numbering and it'll just start building like a brand new bibliography at the end, just because something didn't sync up right. This happens most frequently when someone's on a PC and someone's on a Mac, just because those are two very different types of or versions of Word. But it can happen at any time. So there are two ways around that. There is this concept of a traveling library, which is essentially a library that gets created with this document and piggybacks along for the ride when people are sending the Word document back and forth. So theoretically, the way this workflow would be is I start the paper, I email it to Bridget. Bridget exports the traveling library, adds it to her library. And what that does is it pulls in all of the missing references into her library, and it tells her version of Word to talk to her version of EndNote. So then she's able to interact with it as she normally would. She sends it back to me. I export traveling library, and then I continue writing. That is a terrible, terrible workflow. And it's foolproof and it will always work unless someone forgets that export traveling library step, and then things can get broken. So if you are writing collaboratively, what I recommend and what we do when we're writing is we don't actually insert the references yet. We type along and then we just say, Smith 2012. And we type along, and write, 2016 until the document's finished. And then when we're done, to some satisfactory level of doneness, someone just goes in and just inserts the references, so they'll just pop in and say EndNote and then Smith, if there was a Smith 2020 or 2012, and then insert them kind of all at the end. That is not an elegant or like sexy solution, but it works 100% of the time, and it keeps you from having to troubleshoot weird library reference issues when you're dealing with multiple people. So it just depends on how you're writing. Writing yourself, it's perfectly fine to cite while you write. Writing as a group, wait until the end and just do it. So some people also, they'll just write the references, just make a note of reference in like a comment or something like that. And then, someone, like a lowly, grad student or whatever will go through and just add the references kind of right at the end of the process. Again, it seems, it's not very, it doesn't seem like it's the best, most efficient way to do it, but it is for most cases because people will almost always mess up the sharing component. And related to that, I did see someone else mentioned using Word online. So this is where I mentioned that EndNote is sort of behind the curve here. If you write with Word online, the O365 version where it's like cloud-based and it's sort of like a Google Doc situation, EndNote hasn't got there yet. There's not an EndNote plugin for Word online. I do check like once a month because it will come, it's just not there yet. If you're really like into that, which most people are, obviously, you might want to look into using SciWheel. SciWheel is another tool. It's very similar, exactly the same, in fact, but they have a Google Doc and an online Word plugin. So if that's how you work, I would recommend checking out SciWheel. Again, it functions the exact same. Download references, import them, insert them into Word docs. It's just a different plugin basically that you need. So it's something to keep in mind. EndNote will get there eventually. They sort of made their career on using innovations that other programs have come up with and then sort of like incorporating them into theirs. So it'll get there. They're just not there yet. Hopefully that helps.
Great. A couple more questions, Drew.
Sure.
If you have a full citation, can you import it as is? For example, NHANES data.
Yeah, so there's actually that's a good question. I'm not sure if you can. Let me see. No, it looks like you go piecemeal. And so you would kind of pick whatever thing you're looking at and then just plop it in, paste it in here. Seems to be the best way to do that. But yeah, that's a good question. I'll actually look into that because I'm not 100% certain on that response. But the way I would do it initially is just paste into the relevant fields in EndNote.
Great. Sarah, I'll take a note of your question so that Drew can follow up on that for you.
Yeah,
And
thanks.
then one more, how do you link the references in the same order as cited in the manuscript text?
So that is typically determined by the style. So what style would do that? Does APA do that? Oh, so this is alphabetical. So yeah, if I think Vancouver was, yeah. So how the bibliography displays is based on the style. So in this one, it's order of appearance. So 1, 2, 3, 2 already. If you want it alphabetical, like an APA style, it's done that way. Oftentimes you'll be told which style to use. But again, there's something that you can, always something you can update or tweak. So a lot of times a journal won't tell you which style it is. They'll say, this is an example of what we want it to look like. And you're like, well, that's not helpful at all. So just tell me what style to plug into my program that everyone uses. So there are websites that you basically paste the reference in and it tells you what style is most relevant to that. EndNote has one as well if you just Google it. But you can find a style that fits whatever need that you have based on who you're writing this for. But yeah, so that's all determined by the style here.
Great. A
Any
few
questions?
more. Let's see. Oh, I don't see any more questions in the chat. Anyone else have questions?
Cool. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to the library. It's EndNote's one of those programs that is fairly straightforward and simple when everything works correctly. But the second one thing gets off, it kind of just it goes way off. And it's sometimes hard to track down what the problem is and how to fix it. So we at the library are pretty good at that. If it's a really bad issue, we have a good relationship with EndNote support, so we can work collaboratively with them. If it's something beyond just how things are working and connections and things like that.
Great, thanks, Drew. If there are no more questions, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. As usual. Oh, sorry, one more question.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
Yeah, Deborah, go ahead. Can you import your work from Mendeley to EndNote?
Yeah, so there is a common bibliographic format called RIS. So typically you can export references as RIS from any of these programs. So you would export from Mendeley as RIS, and you would import, again, using the manual import, that file, and then tell it that it's an RIS file. So we didn't really get to the import option stuff because it handles a lot of that automatically. But if you're using something that's not from a database, you need to tell EndNote where you're getting it from. So an RIS file will be read the same way as this file from PubMed was. And Mendeley's structured data, everything should copy over relatively cleanly. People move back and forth between these programs all the time, so there is nice that there's that standardized format that you can use.
Great. A couple more. Can you briefly remind us how to change Word's default citation manager?
You don't have to change it. Word still has its own citations manager that's really awful. But you can see I have an old version of EndNote. I have Mendeley's. I have SciWheels, and they tend to all ignore each other. So you can pretty much just install whatever you want and use whatever you want. There's no real reason to update anything apart from just installing the ribbon. The problem is obviously I can't use both of these in the same. I can't write half of it in EndWheel and then start adding references in SciWheel and expect Word to know what the hell's going on. So you just have to kind of pick one and stick with it. But yeah, you don't have to change much on top of that.
Great. How do you download the ribbon?
So if you're using the desktop, it'll install automatically. If you're using the web version, it's under downloads and then cite while you write. If you ever have lost it for whatever reason, it's been a while since I've done this, so bear with me for a second. So yeah, if you're under on the PC anyway, if you're under tools, there's a couple different ways to do it. You can work with the citation style or the citation plugins here, or I believe under help and download EndNote plugins. And I'm pretty sure that just takes you to the web version. So what you would do is you would download the web version, and then inside of Word, just switch it to desktop application.
Great. Okay, cool. He'll download the plugin. And the other question, Anna Carolina, yeah, a recording will be available. It'll be at its.weill.cornell/Tech Tuesdays. And also a follow-up email goes out to everyone who registered with a link to that recording.
Cool.
All right. It looks like things have slowed down. Thanks so much, Drew, and thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, no problem. Again, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions.
Great. Have a great day, everyone.